Today we're going to look at the hypothalamus, the posterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary. We're also going to look at thyroid hormones in development and calcium homeostasis, and look at the pancreas and the regulation of blood glucose levels. And here we see the primary components of the endocrine system: the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, the neurohypophysis, which is the posterior pituitary gland, and the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior pituitary gland, the thyroid and parathyroid, the thymus, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the testes or ovaries. Now, the pineal gland secretes melatonin, and its secretion of melatonin is regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And the SCN functions as the major biological clock in vertebrates that entrains body processes to the circadian rhythm. And melatonin levels fall during daytime and increase during darkness, and it regulates the sleep-wake cycle and temperature cycles. The pituitary gland is a compound gland. It consists of the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis and the anterior pituitary or the adenohypophysis. And the pituitary gland hangs from a stalk from the hypothalamus at the base of the brain. Now, the posterior pituitary stores and releases two hormones. So these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, which means that these are neurohormones. They're actually produced in neurons rather than in endocrine glands. And one of those neurohormones is antidiuretic hormone, which is involved in the stimulation of water reabsorption by the kidney. It inhibits urine production, and we talked about it during one of the kidney lectures regarding its role in the insertion of additional aquaporins in the collecting ducts of the nephron, which then triggers an increase in water moving from the collecting duct back into the renal medulla of the kidney, which decreases urine output. Oxytocin is another neurohormone produced by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary. And in mammals, oxytocin stimulates milk ejection and also uterine contractions. And so when pregnancies go post-term, oxytocin is administered to induce labor. And oxytocin has also been identified as a regulator of reproductive behavior in both men and women. It's thought to be involved in promoting pair bonding, which is where it's earned the name the cuddle hormone, as well as sexual responses, arousal, orgasm. And it's thought that for these effects, it's actually operating as a paracrine signaling chemical inside the central nervous system, acting more as a neurotransmitter than a hormone. Now, differing from the posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary gland does produce hormones. In fact, it produces and releases 7 hormones. However, even though it does produce hormones, it is under the regulation of the hypothalamus, as is also the posterior pituitary. Now, of all the hormones produced in the anterior pituitary, I just want to highlight or briefly touch on 2 of them, specifically growth hormone, which stimulates the growth of muscle, the growth of bone, and other tissues. It's also essential for metabolism regulation, and then also thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine, which in turn regulates development and metabolism by binding nuclear receptors in target cells. Now, 2 of the hormones that we're going to talk about that are produced in the thyroid gland are thyroxine and calcitonin. And thyroxine and its derivative triiodothyronine are involved in the regulation of the basal metabolic rate. So they regulate enzymes that are involved in carbohydrate and lipid metabolism. And maybe you've heard of the condition hypothyroidism. Involves low metabolism, and it's due to the underproduction of thyroxine. And then there's also hyperthyroidism, which involves the overproduction of thyroxine. And this is where people are going to have a high metabolism, and these individuals are many times underweight. And let's go ahead and watch a McGraw-Hill video showing thyroxine activity in the cell.
Thyroxine is a water-insoluble hormone that is brought to the target cell via a protein carrier. Because it is lipophilic, thyroxine can easily pass through the cell membrane. Thyroxine contains 4 iodines and is often abbreviated T4, tetraiodothyronine. The thyroid gland also secretes smaller amounts of a similar molecule that has only 3 iodines, called triiodothyronine, T3. Both hormones enter target cells, but all the T4 that enters is converted into T3. Thus, only the T3 form of the hormone enters the nucleus and binds to nuclear receptor proteins. The hormone receptor protein complex, in turn, binds to the appropriate hormone response elements on DNA. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at the site where it binds. The messenger RNA, mRNA, produced then codes for specific proteins.
Now, in amphibians, thyroxine triggers metamorphosis. In tadpoles that are in the pre-metamorphic stage, the stimulation of the posterior pituitary gland by the hypothalamus results in the secretion of thyroid-stimulating hormone. TSH then stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine. When thyroxine binds the nuclear receptors and its target cells, it initiates the changes in gene expression necessary for metamorphosis. And thyroxine reaches its maximal level during metamorphosis, and at that point, forelimbs begin to form and the tail is reabsorbed. Now, calcitonin, which is also released by the thyroid, is involved in maintaining calcium levels in the blood. It stimulates the uptake of calcium into bones, which then lowers blood calcium levels. Now, this isn't quite as important when it comes to adults and the day-to-day regulation of calcium. However, it does play a very large role in development and growth, and specifically bone remodeling in children. Now, the adrenal glands produce and secrete a number of hormones. However, we're going to talk about epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. And when the adrenal medulla receives a neural input, it secretes epinephrine, which increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, and also increases glucose availability by increasing blood glucose levels. In addition, we see reduced blood flow to the skin and the digestive organs, and increased blood flow to the heart and to the muscles. And this is part of the short-term stress response. So after a meal, when a person eats carbohydrates, blood glucose concentrations rise. And blood glucose directly activates the secretion of insulin by beta cells in the pancreas. These beta cells are found in the islets of Langerhans. In addition to that, increased blood glucose inhibits the secretion of glucagon by another type of cell in the pancreas called an alpha cell. And what insulin does is it promotes the cellular uptake of glucose into the liver, the muscle, and the fat or adipocytes. And that glucose that's taken up is either going to be metabolized, or it'll be stored as glycogen in the liver and muscle, or converted to fat in the fat cells. Now, between meals, when the concentration of blood glucose falls, insulin secretion decreases and glucagon secretion increases. And what glucagon does is it promotes the hydrolysis of that stored glycogen that's in the liver, and also it makes the fat in the adipose tissue available for energy as well. So then as a result of glucagon increasing in concentration, glucose and fatty acids are released in the blood, and then they can be taken up by cells and used for energy. Now, both insulin and glucagon inhibit their own secretion via a negative feedback loop that's connected to their effects. When insulin is released during periods of high blood glucose levels, its action of triggering the uptake of glucose from the blood results in lower blood glucose levels, which in turn inhibits the continued secretion of insulin. And on the other hand, with glucagon, its release is triggered by low glucose levels, and its activity results in the increase in blood glucose levels. So its effect then, through negative feedback, decreases the signal that causes its release. And then the ovaries and testes release estrogen and progesterone, testosterone and its derivatives, which are sex steroids that regulate reproductive development. And then this is a list of mammalian hormones, all of which we discussed at least briefly today. This would be a good study tool for the exam that's coming up. And so today we looked at the hypothalamus, the posterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary, and how the hypothalamus regulates both portions of the pituitary gland. We also took a look at thyroid hormones in development, and also calcium homeostasis. And we took a look at pancreatic hormones and how they regulate blood glucose levels. And that is the last of the material for the semester. Good job, everyone, for making it through to this point. And I will send out some announcements regarding review sessions that I'm going to hold towards the end of Dead Week.